The Vampire King stared at his phone as his dead wife's contact lit up, her panicked voice shrieking, "My water broke!" Everyone thought she was gone forever, but what no one knew was that some vampiric bonds transcend death, and now he had 12 hours to find her before whatever was growing inside her tore through the veil between worlds. Marcus Draven's fingers tightened around the obsidian armrests of his throne as the phone's screen went black, Elena's face vanishing like smoke. 6 months. 6 months since he had knelt beside her hospital bed, watching her chest rise and fall for the last time, her hand growing cold in his as the court physician whispered about metaphysical rejection syndrome and impossibilities. 6 months since he had carried her ashes to their private garden and released them into the midnight wind, each mote of her essence scattering like dying stars. The phone trembled in his grip, its metal casing groaning under pressure that could crush stone. Her heartbeat. He had heard her heartbeat through the speaker, that unique rhythm he had memorized during countless nights with his ear pressed to her chest, counting the spaces between beats like a meditation. But beneath it, threading through like a serpent through silk, came something else entirely, a pulse that made his ancient vampire senses recoil with primal unease. The second heartbeat carried notes of otherworld, frequencies that shouldn't exist in any realm he knew, arcane and hungry and wrong. Marcus rose from his throne, the movement sharp and predatory, his reflection fracturing across the polished obsidian walls that surrounded him like a tomb. The territorial treaties scattered forgotten across his desk, their ancient seals and blood-stained signatures meaningless now against the impossibility crackling through his phone's silence. Elena's voice had been real as the pain that carved fresh wounds through his chest with every remembered syllable. "My water broke," she had gasped, terror threading through words that should never have reached him from beyond death's veil. "Something's wrong, the baby they had never had, the child that vampire physiology made impossible, the dream that had died with her in that sterile hospital room where machines beeped their electronic funeral songs." Marcus moved through his obsidian sanctuary like a caged predator, past mirrors that showed him a creature whose immortal composure was fracturing, whose eyes blazed with something between hope and madness. 3 years ago, Elena Rosehart had walked into his world during Seraphina's complicated delivery, her hands steady as she guided a hybrid birth that should have killed both mother and child. She had looked up from her work, auburn hair escaping its practical bun, emerald eyes meeting his without the fear or calculation that marked most encounters with the Vampire King. Just professional curiosity and something that might have been gentle amusement at his hovering presence in the delivery chamber. A supernatural midwife, she had explained later over wine in his private chambers. Her calling to help impossible births in a world where vampire and human genetics played by different rules. Their courtship had been a dance of midnight conversations and shared silences, her steady heartbeat becoming the soundtrack to his centuries of solitude. The bonding ceremony under the blood moon had felt like awakening from a long dream, ancient words binding their souls with silver threads that should have made separation impossible. Elena's essence had woven itself through his immortal core, her warmth tempering the cold hunger that defined his nature. Then came the changes. Subtle at first, just unusual cravings for rare meats and an aversion to sunlight that seemed beyond normal human sensitivity. Elena had laughed off his concerns, claiming pregnancy symptoms, though they both knew such things were myths in their world. The weakness followed, a gradual dimming of her vibrant energy that no physician could explain. Strange dreams plagued her sleep, visions of shadowed figures and ancient rituals that left her gasping and disoriented. The court physician had run test after test, his instruments detecting anomalies that defied classification. Metaphysical rejection syndrome, he had finally declared, a condition where human physiology began rejecting supernatural influence, usually fatal within weeks. Marcus had watched helplessly as Elena faded, her body fighting against the very bonds that connected them, until that final night when her heart stopped beating and took half his world with it. The phone buzzed against his palm, jarring him from memory's grip. Elena's contact photo appeared again, but this time with a text message that burned itself across his vision. GPS coordinates for somewhere across the city, followed by words that made his dead heart attempt to beat. Hurry, 12 hours, the binding won't hold. Marcus stared at the message until the letters seemed to writhe like living things, his reflection in the phone's black screen showing a face he barely recognized. The vampire king who had ruled for 3 centuries, who had negotiated treaties with ancient powers and commanded respect through strength and cunning, looked like a man drowning in possibilities he couldn't understand. His thumb hovered over Elena's contact, trembling with the urge to call back, to hear her voice again and confirm that grief hadn't finally driven him beyond reason's edge. But something deeper than hope or desperation stayed his hand. The heartbeats he had heard through the phone's speaker echoed in his memory. Elena's familiar rhythm, overlaid with something that made his supernatural instincts scream warnings. Whatever had contacted him carried Elena's voice and Elena's love, but it brought something else along for the ride, something that pulsed with otherworldly hunger. Marcus pocketed the phone and moved through obsidian corridors with vampire speed, his footsteps silent on polished stone that reflected his passage like dark water. The emergency council chamber lay 3 levels down, accessible only through blood recognition scanners and wards that could incinerate unauthorized intruders. Serafina would be there, her witch-vampire hybrid nature making her uniquely qualified to interpret supernatural anomalies. Victor would attend as well, his military strategist mind already calculating threats and responses before Marcus finished explaining. The chamber doors recognized his approach and swung open with barely a whisper, revealing the circular space where decisions affecting the supernatural world were made. Serafina sat at the obsidian table, her ageless features marked by the kind of weariness that came from witnessing too many centuries of impossible things. Silver hair cascaded over shoulders that had borne the weight of ancient knowledge since before human civilization learned to write. Her fingers traced protective symbols across the table's surface, leaving trails of phosphorescent light that faded as quickly as they appeared. Victor occupied the chair opposite her, his broad frame still carrying the bearing of the Roman centurion he had been before vampirism claimed him. Scars from 1,000 battles marked his arms and neck, testament to conflicts that spanned empires and ages. Both advisors looked up as Marcus entered, their expressions shifting from routine attention to sharp concern as they registered his obvious distress. Marcus placed his phone on the table between them, Elena's contact photo still glowing on the screen like a small window into impossible hope. The story spilled from him in terse, precise sentences that couldn't quite contain the chaos beneath. Elena's call, her voice speaking of water breaking and babies that couldn't exist, the heartbeats he had detected through supernatural senses that had never lied to him before. Victor's response came swift and predictable, his military mind immediately cataloging potential threats and hostile intentions. Psychological warfare, he declared, probably orchestrated by the Shadowmere clan who had challenged Marcus's territorial boundaries for decades. A recording of Elena's voice, perhaps captured during one of her visits to neutral ground, now weaponized to exploit the vampire king's grief. Technical analysis would reveal the deception, Victor insisted, his scarred hands already reaching for communication devices to summon forensic specialists. But Serafina had gone pale during Marcus's recounting, her fingers stilling their protective tracery, as something like recognition flickered behind her ancient eyes. The witch-vampire hybrid sat in silence for long moments, her gaze fixed on Elena's photo, while thoughts moved behind her expression like shadows behind frosted glass. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of secrets that had fermented in darkness for too long. Elena had come to her, Serafina revealed, perhaps 3 weeks before her final illness began to manifest. not for medical consultation or supernatural healing, but with questions that had made even Serafina's extensive knowledge seem inadequate. Theoretical bindings, Elena had called them, soul anchors that could survive the destruction of physical form, ways to preserve connection beyond death's traditional boundaries. The conversation had felt urgent despite Elena's attempts at casual inquiry, her questions probing deeper into forbidden territories of magic that most practitioners avoided for good reason. Serafina had begun explaining the theoretical frameworks, the ancient rituals that claimed to bind souls across the veil between life and death, when an emergency elsewhere in the city had demanded her immediate attention. Elena had promised to return for the rest of the discussion, but her illness had manifested within days, consuming her attention and strength until death claimed her. Now Serafina suspected that Elena had sought out other sources, perhaps completing research into bindings that Serafina would never have endorsed. Soul anchor rituals were notoriously unstable, she explained, often trapping the practitioner between realms in a state that was neither life nor death, but something worse than both. If Elena had attempted such magic during pregnancy, the results could be catastrophic, creating a hybrid consciousness that fed on the boundary between worlds. The GPS coordinates on Marcus's phone seemed to pulse with malevolent purpose as Serafina's words settled into the chamber's silence, and somewhere in the distance, a clock began counting down 12 hours toward whatever Elena's voice had promised to bring into their world. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Marcus burst from the council chamber with vampire speed that turned the obsidian corridors into blurred streaks of black stone and silver light, his enhanced reflexes carrying him through the ancient stronghold's labyrinthine passages faster than mortal eyes could track. The GPS coordinates burned in his mind like a brand, pulling him through rain-slicked streets where neon signs bled color across wet asphalt and late-night pedestrians became mere shadows in his peripheral vision. The city transformed around him into an impressionist painting of motion and light, skyscrapers stretching into smears of glass and steel, while traffic signals pulsed their warnings to empty air. His supernatural senses catalogued every scent and sound as he moved, filtering through the urban chaos for any trace of the impossible presence that had spoken through Elena's voice. The coordinates led him through increasingly desolate neighborhoods where broken streetlights, cast pools of sickly yellow illumination, and abandoned storefronts stared out through shattered windows like dead eyes. St. Morgana's maternity hospital rose before him like a monument to forgotten grief, its neo-Gothic architecture twisted into grotesque shapes by 20 years of neglect and urban decay. The building's facade bore the scars of its abandonment, windows boarded with rotting plywood that bore graffiti tags in languages Marcus didn't recognize, symbols that seemed to writhe when observed directly. Ivy crawled across the stonework in patterns that suggested deliberate cultivation rather than natural growth, its leaves bearing an oily sheen that reflected the streetlights with unnatural intensity. Marcus's enhanced senses recoiled from the building's emanations, supernatural instincts screaming warnings about energies that shouldn't exist in any realm he understood. The hospital's history pressed against his consciousness like a physical weight. Memories of that terrible night 20 years ago, when 17 newborns had died simultaneously, despite the frantic efforts of doctors and nurses who found themselves helpless against a plague that medical science couldn't identify or explain. The official investigation had concluded with bureaucratic language about unknown pathogens and systemic failures, but the supernatural community knew better. Something had been summoned that night. Something hungry and patient that had fed on innocent life before vanishing back beyond the veil, leaving only questions and a building that no amount of cleansing could purify. As Marcus approached the main entrance, his vampire senses detected the impossible scent that had haunted his dreams since Elena's death. Jasmine and vanilla mixed with the copper tang of blood, impossibly fresh despite the months that had passed since her funeral. But beneath Elena's familiar fragrance lurked something else entirely, a metallic sweetness that made his fangs ache and his dead heart attempt to beat, the scent of otherworldly blood that carried notes of starlight and shadow. Security cameras mounted on surrounding buildings turned to track his movement with mechanical precision, their red recording lights pulsing in synchronization like electronic heartbeats that counted down toward some unknowable deadline. The watchers revealed themselves as subtle shifts in the shadows that pooled between abandoned structures, vampiric silhouettes that vanished the moment Marcus focused his enhanced vision on their positions. They moved with the fluid grace of his own kind, but carried an wrongness that marked them as something other than the vampires he knew, creatures that bore familiar shapes while serving alien purposes. His phone buzzed against his chest, Elena's contact appearing again with a message that made the building's windows seem to flicker with internal light. Third floor. Room 313. Come alone. They're watching. The words carried undertones that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the bond that should have died with Elena's body, a connection that pulsed with desperate urgency and growing pain. Marcus crushed the phone's casing with fingers that could rend steel, its destruction meaningless now that the message had burned itself into his consciousness, and stepped through the hospital's main entrance into air that tasted of antiseptic and ancient grief. Emergency lighting cast sickly green shadows down corridors lined with peeling paint and water stains that formed patterns suggesting deliberate artistry rather than structural decay. The floors bore a carpet of dust and debris that muffled his footsteps, but couldn't hide the deeper sounds that echoed through the building's bones, whispers in languages that predated human speech, and the distant sound of machinery that shouldn't function in an abandoned structure. Elena's scent grew stronger as Marcus navigated deeper into the hospital's maze, following olfactory threads that led him past examination rooms where rusted medical equipment stood sentinel over memories of healing and hope. The walls bore scars that spoke of violence rather than time's gentle erosion, claw marks that raked through plaster to expose the building's metal skeleton and burn patterns that suggested fires hot enough to melt stone. Marcus climbed crumbling stairs that groaned under his weight despite his supernatural grace, past floors where shadows moved with purposes of their own, and doorways opened onto rooms that seemed larger inside than architectural logic should allow. On the second-floor landing, his enhanced hearing detected movement that carried the distinctive rhythm of vampire breathing, controlled and deliberate in a way that spoke of predators waiting in ambush. Damien Shadowmere stepped from the darkness of a collapsed nurse's station, his pale form draped in surgical scrubs that bore fresh bloodstains in patterns too artistic to be accidental. The Shadowmere air had always been beautiful in the way that predators were beautiful, with sharp cheekbones and eyes like chips of Arctic ice that held no warmth even when he smiled. Two lieutenants flanked him, their own surgical attire suggesting participation in procedures that had nothing to do with healing, their faces bearing the kind of satisfaction that came from inflicting precise and calculated suffering. Damien's voice carried the cultured tones of European nobility tinged with something that might have been genuine concern if it hadn't been wrapped in barely concealed threat. Anomalous metaphysical activity, he explained with the air of someone discussing weather patterns, readings that their monitoring equipment had been detecting for the past several hours, energies that threatened to destabilize the careful balance between supernatural factions that maintained peace in the city. Marcus's arrival at this particular location suggested involvement in whatever was manifesting, and the Shadowmere clan demanded explanations before the situation escalated beyond their ability to contain. When Marcus refused to elaborate on Elena's call or the circumstances that had brought him to St. Morgana's, Damien's expression shifted from diplomatic concern to something far more primitive and dangerous. The vampire's fangs extended with the sound of bone sliding against bone, while his lieutenants moved to flanking positions that spoke of practiced coordination in violence. Your dead wife's resurrection threatens the natural order, Damien declared, his words carrying the weight of ancient law and territorial authority that vampire society used to justify its harshest judgments. We're here to correct that mistake before it spreads beyond our ability to control. The fight erupted with the sudden violence that marked conflicts between apex predators, Marcus's enhanced speed carrying him through space faster than mortal perception, while Damien's own reflexes met his assault with calculated precision. Medical equipment shattered under the impact of bodies moving at superhuman velocity, monitors exploding in showers of sparks and glass, while surgical tables bent and twisted under forces that could rend steel. The lieutenants coordinated their attacks with military efficiency, their movements designed to herd Marcus into positions where Damien's superior experience could be brought to bear. But grief and desperation had transformed the Vampire King into something beyond their calculations. Marcus fought with the fury of someone who had already lost everything that mattered, his claws rending through surgical scrubs and vampire flesh with equal ease, while his enhanced senses tracked every movement in the chaotic melee. One lieutenant crashed through a window in a spray of glass and blood, while the second found himself embedded in a concrete wall with enough force to crack the building's foundation. Damien himself bore fresh wounds that would have killed a mortal creature, his aristocratic features marred by claw marks that leaked blood darker than human crimson. But even as Marcus broke free from their ambush, Elena's psychic voice grew stronger in his mind, desperate words that spoke of time running out and barriers failing, something trying to break through from spaces between worlds where hungry things waited for opportunities to cross over. The third floor beckoned with promises and threats in equal measure. Room 313 calling to him through bonds that death should have severed, but somehow hadn't. And Marcus abandoned his defeated opponents to follow Elena's increasingly frantic summons toward whatever truth awaited behind that numbered door. The corridor leading to room 313 stretched longer than the building's architecture should have allowed, its walls bearing medical charts and equipment that flickered between abandonment and active use, as if the hospital existed in multiple states simultaneously. Emergency lighting pulsed in rhythm with something that might have been breathing, and the temperature dropped with each step until Marcus's breath would have misted if vampire physiology permitted such human responses. Elena's scent intensified to almost overwhelming levels, jasmine and vanilla now mixed with copper, and that otherworldly sweetness that made his supernatural instincts recoil in warning. Marcus kicked down the door to room 313 with force enough to embed it in the opposite wall, revealing a delivery room that seemed to exist partially in this reality and partially somewhere else entirely. Elena lay on a hospital bed that flickered between rust-stained abandonment and pristine medical functionality, her form shifting from solid flesh to translucent spirit like a dying hologram struggling to maintain coherence. She wore the same midnight blue dress from their bonding ceremony, its silk fabric now soaked with blood, and some luminescent fluid that moved with its own intelligence, spreading in patterns that suggested conscious design rather than natural flow. Her emerald eyes focused on him with desperate relief that cut through his heart like silver blades, love and terror warring in her expression as she reached toward him with fingers that sometimes passed through the air like mist and sometimes grasped with desperate strength. "Marcus, you came," she gasped, through labor pains that made the room's lights flicker and the temperature plummet another 10 degrees, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke of spaces between worlds where physics bent to accommodate impossible possibilities. "I can feel it trying to break through," she continued, her words punctuated by contractions that seemed to tear at reality itself. "We don't have much time before it finds a way to cross over completely." Elena's explanation came in fragments between waves of otherworldly agony, revelations that transformed Marcus's understanding of their love and loss into something far more complex and dangerous than grief alone. Their bonding had created an anchor point stronger than either had understood, a connection that transcended physical death and held her soul in a liminal space where consciousness could persist without flesh to contain it. But the pregnancy she carried wasn't their child in any sense that mattered, Elena revealed through gasps that made the hospital room's windows rattle in their frames. But something else entirely that had used their connection as a doorway between realms. A hybrid consciousness that fed on the boundary between life and death, growing stronger with each moment as it prepared to break through into their reality with hunger that could consume worlds. As Elena's labor intensified, the room around them began to warp and change, medical equipment morphing between abandoned decay and impossible functionality, while shadows moved with purposes that had nothing to do with light sources, and Marcus realized that whatever was about to be born would change everything he thought he knew about love, death, and the prices that desperate hearts were willing to pay for one more chance at forever. Elena's confession came between contractions that shook St. Morgana's hospital to its foundation, each wave of otherworldly pain sending tremors through the building's bones while emergency lighting flickered like dying stars. 3 weeks before her death, she gasped through labor that was tearing holes in reality itself. 3 weeks before the illness that everyone thought was metaphysical rejection syndrome, she had discovered the impossible truth that her body carried life that shouldn't exist, according to every law of vampire and human physiology. A hybrid child, Elena revealed through words that came in fragments between spasms of agony that made the room's windows crack and the temperature plummet toward absolute zero. A fusion of Marcus's immortal essence and her mortal blood that created something unprecedented in all the centuries of supernatural history. The discovery had filled her with wonder and terror in equal measure. Hope for a future that their bonding had never quite dared to promise, shadowed by the certainty that such a pregnancy would kill her within weeks, as her human biology rejected the vampiric components growing within her womb. Desperate to save their child and preserve some fragment of the love they had built together, Elena had sought out sources of power that existed beyond the carefully regulated boundaries of the supernatural community, eventually finding her way to Morgana Blackthorn through whispered references in ancient texts and desperate inquiries among practitioners who dealt in forbidden knowledge. Morgana had been everything Elena needed and nothing she expected. A rogue witch whose beauty masked centuries of accumulated malice and whose offer of salvation came wrapped in terms that seemed almost generous in their simplicity. The binding ritual, Morgana had explained with the patient tone of someone selling salvation to the desperate, would preserve both mother and child beyond death's traditional boundaries, creating soul anchors that could survive the destruction of physical form while maintaining consciousness and connection across the veil between worlds. Elena had agreed without understanding the true price, without recognizing that Morgana's magic came with costs that transcended mere sacrifice and ventured into territories where even death became a lesser evil than the alternatives. The ritual required Elena's life force as an anchor point, Morgana had revealed only after the binding was already in progress, her essence becoming a tether that would hold their child's soul in the space between life and death, while something else filled the vacuum her sacrifice created. A primordial entity that Morgana called the Threshold Guardian, a being of immense age and hunger that existed in the spaces between realms and fed on the boundaries that separated different dimensions of reality. Elena realized too late that she had made their unborn child into a vessel for an ancient consciousness that viewed physical reality as nothing more than a feeding ground. Her desperate love transformed into a doorway for something that could consume worlds if given sufficient opportunity. The binding had proceeded, despite her growing horror, Morgana's magic weaving through Elena's essence like silver threads that carried poison in their beautiful patterns, anchoring her soul to the liminal space where the Threshold Guardian waited with patience born of eons spent in darkness between stars. Elena's subsequent illness hadn't been metaphysical rejection syndrome at all, but the gradual displacement of her consciousness as the entity prepared to inhabit the hybrid form growing in her womb, her life force slowly being drained to fuel a summoning that would bring something ancient and hungry into their reality. She had died knowing that Marcus would blame himself for her loss, that her sacrifice would seem like medical tragedy rather than the desperate gamble it truly was. And now she flickered between existence and void, while the thing wearing their child's developing form prepared to break through into a world unprepared for its particular appetites. Elena's words came faster now as her ethereal form began destabilizing, translucent flesh wavering like heat mirages, while the entity within her soul body pressed against the boundaries of her increasingly fragile existence. The contractions were tearing holes in the fabric of reality itself, each spasm opening brief glimpses into dimensions where geometry followed different rules and hungry things waited for opportunities to slip through the cracks between worlds. Marcus watched in horror as the hospital room began stretching beyond its physical dimensions, walls extending into impossible distances, while the ceiling rose toward heights that should have intersected with upper floors, but instead opened onto star-filled voids where constellations spelled out words in languages that predated human speech. Medical equipment morphed from rusted abandonment into organic shapes that pulsed with their own internal rhythms, monitors becoming clusters of eyes that tracked movement with alien intelligence while surgical instruments transformed into writhing appendages that reached toward Elena's flickering form with purposes that had nothing to do with healing. Through her translucent skin, Marcus could see something moving that bore no resemblance to any child of their love. Tentacles of living shadow and starlight that pressed against the boundaries of Elena's soul body, like a caged predator, testing the bars of its confinement. The entity within her had grown beyond the hybrid consciousness Elena had described, feeding on the anchor of her sacrifice to become something far more complex and dangerous than either she or Morgana had anticipated. Elena's scream cut through dimensions as the threshold guardian began its emergence, not through normal birth, but by tearing through the fabric of her ethereal form from within, using her soul as a doorway between realms, while her essence dispersed like smoke in a hurricane. Her form flickered more rapidly now, solid one moment and translucent the next, consciousness struggling to maintain coherence as the entity prepared to cross over completely. She grabbed Marcus's hand with fingers that felt like ice wrapped in electricity, her touch carrying the chill of spaces between stars and the sharp bite of otherworldly energy that made his vampire physiology recoil in primal recognition of predators that operated on entirely different levels of existence. "It's not our child anymore," Elena gasped through words that came from a throat being torn apart by alien presence, her emerald eyes meeting his with desperate love and infinite sorrow. "It never was our child, Marcus. Morgana used me to create a doorway, and now it's strong enough to cross over without needing the anchor I provided." The threshold guardian's thoughts brushed against Marcus's consciousness like glacier winds, carrying whispers from the void between galaxies. Alien intelligence that showed him visions of what would happen when the entity completed its emergence into physical reality. Cities consumed by shadows that moved with hungry purpose, entire populations transformed into extensions of a consciousness that viewed mortal existence as nothing more than fuel for greater workings, the barriers between dimensions dissolving as the Guardian opened permanent gateways for its brethren to follow. Reality itself would become malleable under the entity's influence, physics bending to accommodate the presence of something that existed beyond the laws governing their universe, and Marcus saw himself standing helpless, while everything he had sworn to protect crumbled into chaos that served purposes too alien for mortal comprehension. Elena's final contraction came with a sound like reality tearing along invisible seams, the hospital room exploding into fragments of space and time that reassembled according to geometries that hurt to perceive directly. The threshold guardian emerged not as the hybrid child Elena had imagined, but as a writhing mass of shadow and starfire that immediately began consuming the room's physical matter to stabilize its presence in dimensions where matter and energy followed rules it understood better than the laws of their reality. Medical equipment dissolved into component particles that swirled around the entity's form like galaxies orbiting a black hole, their substance being reorganized into patterns that served the Guardian's alien physiology, while the very air became thick with energies that made breathing an exercise in controlled terror. Elena's soul form dispersed into thousands of motes of light that spiraled upward like ascending stars, her essence finally released from the anchor that had bound her to the liminal space between life and death. Her final words carried on winds that smelled of jasmine and eternity. "I'm sorry," she whispered through voice that came from everywhere and nowhere, love and regret mingling in syllables that would echo in Marcus's memory for whatever time remained before the world ended or transformed beyond recognition. The Guardian's mass began taking humanoid shape with the fluidity of liquid mercury guided by conscious design, its form settling into proportions that combined Elena's remembered beauty with elements that belonged to no earthly creature. The entity's face bore Elena's bone structure, but wrong. Too many teeth filling a mouth that smiled with predatory satisfaction, while eyes like black holes held depths that contained glimpses of the void between stars where time moved differently and distance became meaningless. Its skin shifted between flesh and void, sometimes solid and warm with familiar texture, sometimes transparent to reveal the cosmic horror that inhabited the borrowed form, shadows moving beneath the surface like living tattoos that spelled out equations in dead languages. When it spoke, the voice carried Elena's familiar cadences, twisted into something that made Marcus's enhanced hearing ache with the strain of processing frequencies that shouldn't exist in any realm he understood. "Hello, Father," the Threshold Guardian said with Elena's mouth shaped around words that carried harmonics of collapsing galaxies and dying suns. "Thank you for bringing me through the barriers that have kept my kind locked away for so long." The entity's smile widened beyond the physical limitations of human facial structure, revealing teeth that seemed to extend infinitely inward, like looking down a tunnel lined with razors, while its eyes held depths that promised knowledge and power, at prices that would make death seem like mercy. "Now I can begin my true work," it continued while reaching toward Marcus with hands that flickered between Elena's remembered softness and claws that could rend space itself, bringing my siblings through to complete the reunification of separated dimensions, returning this reality to the state it occupied before primitive minds created boundaries between realms that should never have been divided. Marcus realized with growing horror that destroying this entity would mean severing the bond that still connected him to whatever remained of Elena's essence, their love transformed into the very anchor that allowed the Threshold Guardian to maintain its presence in their reality. The creature before him carried fragments of his beloved wife within its alien consciousness, her memories and emotions serving as the foundation for its understanding of mortal existence. And to strike at it would be to destroy the last traces of the woman whose loss had already broken something fundamental in his immortal soul. The Guardian seemed to sense his recognition of the trap their love had become, its smile taking on nuances of Elena's remembered affection, while its alien thoughts pressed against his consciousness with offers of reunion that came wrapped in the promise of watching reality dissolve into chaos that would feed entities whose hunger transcended anything mortal minds could comprehend. And Marcus understood that the choice before him would determine not just his own fate, but the survival of every living thing in a universe suddenly revealed to be far more fragile and far less protected than anyone had ever dared imagine. The entity that had emerged from Elena's ethereal form straightened to its full height and spoke a name that seemed to reshape the air around it with each syllable, calling itself Umbra, with the casual authority of something that had worn countless identities across eons of existence. As the name settled into reality, the hospital room began transforming around them, walls flowing like liquid mercury, while the ceiling dissolved into a vortex of swirling dark energy that opened onto spaces between stars, where ancient geometries spelled out equations in the fundamental language of creation and destruction. Medical equipment melted and reformed into crystalline structures that pulsed with their own inner light, their surfaces reflecting not the room's emergency lighting, but glimpses of dimensions where physics followed entirely different rules, and the concept of matter itself became merely one option among infinite possibilities. Umbra moved through this transformed space with the fluid grace of something perfectly adapted to environments that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional reality, its form shifting between Elena's remembered beauty and something that belonged to the void between galaxies, flesh becoming shadow and light becoming substance, as the entity demonstrated its mastery over the fundamental forces that most creatures took for granted. "This is what I am," Umbra explained while gesturing toward the reality-bending transformations occurring around them, its voice carrying Elena's familiar cadences, wrapped around harmonics that made Marcus's enhanced hearing strain to process frequencies that shouldn't exist in any realm he understood. One of the primordial entities that existed before your ancestors learned to separate the realms, before primitive minds decided that dimensions should be isolated from each other rather than flowing together in the natural state of unified existence. The separation had been a catastrophe from Umbra's perspective. The entity continued while opening rifts in the air that showed brief glimpses into nightmare dimensions, where vast shapes moved through landscapes of crystallized time and cities built from fossilized screams. A artificial division that had trapped beings like itself beyond barriers maintained by collective will and ignorance, rather than any true understanding of the forces involved. For millennia, Umbra and its siblings had pressed against those barriers, searching for weaknesses that might allow them to return to dimensions where they could feed on the rich complexity of mortal existence and restore the natural flow between realms that separation-obsessed minds had so cruelly disrupted. Elena's sacrifice and the vampire-human hybrid pregnancy had created the perfect anchor point, Umbra revealed with something that might have been gratitude if the emotion hadn't been filtered through alien psychology that viewed mortal suffering as nothing more than interesting data about dimensional physics. The binding ritual that Elena had agreed to in her desperation had opened a doorway between realms, while simultaneously providing the life force necessary to stabilize Umbra's presence in a dimension where its natural form would otherwise dissolve like smoke in a hurricane. The hybrid pregnancy had been particularly elegant, the entity explained while opening another rift that showed glimpses of creatures that existed as living geometric theorems, because it combined vampire immortality with human adaptability in ways that created a consciousness flexible enough to serve as a vessel for something that transcended both species while anchoring that consciousness to physical reality through bonds that most practitioners of magic barely understood. Now that it had successfully crossed over, Umbra could begin the true work of reunification, opening permanent gateways that would allow its siblings to follow while gradually dissolving the barriers that kept dimensions artificially separated, restoring the universe to its natural state, where all realms flowed together in patterns too complex and beautiful for mortal minds to fully comprehend. The entity paused in its explanation to demonstrate the scope of its power, opening a dozen rifts simultaneously while reshaping the hospital room into a nexus where space folded in on itself and multiple dimensions occupied the same coordinates, reality becoming fluid enough that Marcus could see through the walls into parallel versions of the building where different histories had played out with varying degrees of horror and wonder. Through one rift came the sound of singing that might have been beautiful if it hadn't been performed by throats that had never been human, while another showed glimpses of a garden where flowers bloomed with petals made from crystallized anguish and roots that fed on the dreams of sleeping gods. And a third revealed creatures that existed as pure mathematics, given flesh and consciousness, their forms shifting through equations that described the relationship between love and entropy, in terms that made watching them a form of enlightenment that bordered on madness. This is what awaits your reality. Umbra said while gesturing toward the rifts with Elena's remembered hands. Beauty and terror beyond anything your separated dimensions could produce independently. The return to natural unity that your ancestors interrupted through fear and misunderstanding. The entity's offer came wrapped in reasonable tones that carried Elena's voice like a familiar melody played on instruments that had never existed in any mortal realm, a bargain that seemed almost generous despite the cosmic scope of its implications. Marcus could serve as herald in this dimension, Umbra proposed, while the rifts around them pulsed with energies that made the air taste of copper and starlight, helping to prepare other supernatural beings for the changes that reunification would bring, while guiding the process in ways that minimized unnecessary suffering during the transition period. In return for his cooperation, Umbra would restore Elena permanently, not as the flickering soul form that had brought them together, but as a fully realized being who could exist simultaneously across multiple dimensions, their love becoming something that transcended the petty limitations of single-realm existence. The alternative, Umbra continued, while opening rifts that showed glimpses of burning cities and skies, torn open to reveal the void between stars, was far less pleasant for everyone involved, as the entity would be forced to consume every vampire, human, and supernatural being on Earth to fuel its conquest of reality, their life forces being absorbed to power the massive workings necessary to tear down barriers that had been maintained by collective will for thousands of years. Marcus listened to this cosmic horror masquerading as reasonable negotiation, while his mind raced through possibilities and strategies, searching for weaknesses in something that operated according to rules he barely understood, pretending to consider an offer that would transform him into a collaborator in the destruction of everything he had sworn to protect. Umbra seemed pleased by his apparent interest, its alien features taking on expressions that borrowed Elena's remembered warmth, while its eyes held depths that contained glimpses of universes where suffering and joy blended into experiences that transcended both concepts completely. The entity grew impatient as Marcus's consideration, stretched beyond what its borrowed understanding of mortal psychology suggested, was reasonable, and it decided to demonstrate the urgency of his choice by beginning its work on the city below, shadows spreading like infection through rain-slicked streets, as Umbra's influence extended beyond the hospital into the broader urban environment. Through the transformed windows, Marcus watched in horror as the entity's power washed over humans who collapsed, twitching on sidewalks before rising, with hollow eyes that reflected depths usually reserved for deep ocean trenches, their bodies moving with the mechanical precision of puppets controlled by a consciousness that viewed individual identity as an inefficient use of neural resources. Supernatural beings fared worse, their enhanced physiologies making them more sensitive to the dimensional disruption that Umbra's presence created. Vampires writhing in agony as their connection to their own immortal essence became corrupted by alien energies, while witches screamed as their magical abilities turned against them with results that defied description. The transformation spread in expanding circles from St. Morgana's hospital, reality becoming increasingly malleable as Umbra's influence infected the fundamental forces that held the city's physical structure together. Buildings shifting into architectural styles that hurt to perceive directly, while streetlights began pulsing in rhythms that matched the heartbeat of something vast and patient, that waited in dimensions where time flowed backward, and distance could be measured in emotions rather than miles. Serafina and Victor arrived with a strike team equipped with weapons designed to combat supernatural threats, their combined centuries of experience telling them that whatever had manifested at the hospital represented a clear and immediate danger to everything they had sworn to protect. Marcus watched through the transformed windows as his advisors led their forces into the building, their enhanced vampire senses recoiling from energies that made the air itself feel contaminated with otherworldly presence, their weapons charged with silver and blessed by practitioners whose understanding of magic had been refined through centuries of conflict with entities that existed beyond mortal comprehension. The strike team's assault on Umbra proved frustratingly ineffective, their bullets and bladed weapons passing harmlessly through the entity's shifting form, while their magical attacks were absorbed and redirected with casual efficiency that suggested vast experience in dealing with resistance from beings who operated according to more limited understanding of dimensional physics. Umbra laughed at their efforts with Elena's voice, the sound carrying notes of genuine amusement that made the hospital's remaining windows crack, while the entity explained the futility of their resistance with the patient tone of someone educating particularly slow students. "I am bound to this realm through your bonding, Vampire King," Umbra said while gesturing dismissively at the supernatural soldiers, whose weapons continued to prove useless against its otherworldly physiology, anchored by connections that transcend anything your companions understand about the relationship between consciousness and reality. "To destroy me, you must sever the connection that keeps your wife's soul tethered to existence, choosing between your personal love and the survival of your world, a decision that will define not just your character, but the future trajectory of this entire dimension." The entity's words carried implications that made Marcus's dead heart attempt to beat as he realized the true scope of the trap that Elena's desperate love had created. Their bonding transformed into a weapon that used his deepest feelings against everything he had sworn to protect, while offering him a choice between two forms of damnation that would haunt him through whatever eternity remained after his decision. Seraphina's voice cut through the cosmic horror of Umbra's explanation, her ancient witch knowledge channeled into words that revealed the hidden mechanisms underlying Marcus and Elena's bonding with clarity that made the entity's trap even more devastating in its elegant cruelty. "The binding ritual," Seraphina explained, while dodging tentacles of living shadow that reached toward her with predatory intent, had been far more complex than either Marcus or Elena had understood, weaving their souls together so thoroughly that Elena's death hadn't actually severed their connection, but merely shifted her existence to depend entirely on Marcus's life force, her consciousness sustained by energy drawn from his immortal essence in a feedback loop that created perfect conditions for something like Umbra to exploit. The entity had essentially made Elena's continued existence contingent on its own survival. Seraphina continued while her strike team regrouped around her with weapons that sparked and smoked from contact with energies that corroded metal and faith with equal efficiency, creating a situation where killing Umbra would truly destroy Elena forever, while allowing it to live meant the eventual consumption of all reality, starting with their dimension and spreading outward until every realm that had ever been separated would be forcibly reunited under the entity's alien authority. As shadows spread further into the city, consuming buildings and transforming humans into extensions of a consciousness that viewed individual identity as an inefficient allocation of resources, Marcus heard Elena's true voice for the first time since Umbra's emergence, her words coming not through the entity's borrowed vocal cords, but through the bond that connected their souls across the boundaries between life and death. "My love," Elena whispered through connections that bypassed physical sound entirely, carrying directly into Marcus's consciousness with the clarity of absolute truth. "I understand now what I've done, what the ritual really accomplished, and I know that I was selfish and afraid when I made that bargain with Morgana, choosing our personal happiness over the safety of everyone else who might be affected by my desperate attempt to preserve what we had together. The ritual was never about saving our child," Elena continued through words that came wrapped in the warmth of her remembered embrace. "It was about my terror of losing you and the love we had built, my refusal to accept that some things have natural endings that shouldn't be fought against, no matter how much pain their acceptance might cause. Let me go, my beloved Vampire King," she pleaded through bonds that carried the weight of absolute love and infinite sorrow. "Let me rest as I should have done months ago, when my body gave up its struggle to contain what we had created together. Don't let this thing twist our real love into something that destroys everything we tried to protect when we promised to stand together against the darkness that threatens innocent lives." The choice before Marcus crystallized into perfect clarity as Elena's voice faded back into the cosmic cacophony of Umbra's continued assault on reality. His beloved wife offering him permission to do what duty demanded, while the entity that wore her face smiled with too many teeth and waited for his answer to a question that would determine whether love could triumph over its own corruption or whether devotion itself would become the instrument of universal destruction. Marcus drew the ceremonial bonding blade from its sheath at his side, the weapon that had sealed their eternal vows under the blood moon now gleaming with silver light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, its surface inscribed with symbols that represented their connection across time and realm, ancient words that had bound their souls together in ways that transcended the simple joining of flesh and spirit that most couples understood as love. The blade's edge whispered against the air as he raised it toward his own heart, understanding with crystalline clarity that his death would sever all bonds that anchored Umbra to this reality, his immortal essence serving as the final sacrifice that would banish the entity back beyond the veil where it belonged, even as that same action would destroy Elena's soul permanently and condemn him to whatever darkness waited beyond the boundaries of vampire existence. The ceremonial weapon felt heavy in his grasp, weighted not with mere metal, but with the significance of choices that would echo across dimensions, its symbols glowing brighter as it sensed the proximity of the heart it had been forged to either protect or destroy, depending on circumstances that its creators had never imagined when they crafted a blade meant to symbolize eternal devotion rather than serve as an instrument of cosmic sacrifice. Umbra watched his preparation with alien interest, its borrowed features showing curiosity about mortal psychology rather than concern for its own survival. The entity apparently confident that Marcus's love for Elena would prevent him from taking action that would destroy her soul along with its own anchor to reality, its smile carrying Elena's remembered warmth wrapped around predatory satisfaction that suggested vast experience in manipulating the emotions of creatures whose understanding of existence remained limited by single-realm perspective. But Elena's voice stopped him before the blade could complete its journey toward his heart, her sole presence touching his consciousness with urgency that bypassed the entity's awareness. Words carried through bonds that Umbra couldn't fully control, despite its mastery over the mechanisms that kept her tethered to existence. "Not like that," Elena whispered through connections that existed deeper than the parasitic entity could reach. "There's another way, my love. But you have to trust me one more time. Trust in something that I learned too late, but that might still save us both, if you're brave enough to let go of everything we thought we knew about our connection." Elena's soul voice carried knowledge that she had gained through her months of existence between realms, understanding of magical principles that her desperate bargain with Morgana had taught her through direct experience with forces that most practitioners only theorized about, revelations about the true nature of binding rituals that came from being trapped within their mechanisms rather than merely studying them from academic distance. Morgana's ritual had indeed included a reversal mechanism, Elena explained through words that came wrapped in love and desperate hope. A safety valve that the witch had built into her magic, not from any sense of mercy, but as protection against the possibility that her summoned entities might turn against her if given sufficient opportunity. If the anchor willingly broke the bond during a moment of pure love rather than despair or resignation, Elena revealed through soul speech that made Marcus's immortal essence ache with possibilities he had never dared imagine. The resulting backlash would destroy any entity feeding on the connection, while preserving both souls for whatever came after death, allowing them to move on together, rather than separately into whatever realm waited beyond the veil. "It means we'll both move on, Marcus," Elena continued through bonds that pulsed with warmth, that transcended physical sensation. "Truly together this time, without the complications of magic or binding rituals or desperate bargains with entities that view love as nothing more than useful energy to be harvested and consumed. Our connection purified by willing sacrifice, rather than corrupted by selfish fear." The choice she offered him was both simpler and more complex than the blade's promise of individual martyrdom, requiring not just courage to die, but wisdom to release attachments that had defined his existence for centuries. Love transformed from possession into gift freely given without expectation of return or permanence beyond the moment of absolute connection. Umbra sensed the shift in Marcus's intentions even before he lowered the ceremonial blade, its alien consciousness pressing against their bond with increasing urgency as it realized that Elena's soul carried knowledge that threatened its continued existence in ways that simple destruction could not. The entity's borrowed features twisting into expressions that blended Elena's beauty with cosmic horror as it began extending tendrils of living shadow toward the city's inhabitants in desperate attempt to anchor itself to reality through multiple connections rather than depending solely on Marcus's life force. Reality continued fracturing around them as Umbra's power grew stronger through its expanding network of possessed humans, the hospital room stretching into impossible dimensions, while windows showed glimpses of streets where shadows moved with predatory intelligence, and buildings shifted between architectural styles that hurt to perceive directly. The entity's influence spreading outward in waves that transformed everything they touched, according to alien aesthetics that valued function over beauty and efficiency over the chaotic complexity that made mortal existence meaningful. Marcus felt Elena's soul presence drawing closer to his consciousness, not through the binding that had tethered her to existence, but through something deeper and more fundamental, the love that had existed before magic touched their lives, and that could survive the dissolution of supernatural connections if they were brave enough to trust in its essential nature. Their final moment of intimacy came not through physical touch, but through complete spiritual merger, memories flowing between them like water finding its level. Their entire relationship experienced simultaneously from both perspectives, with clarity that revealed every joy and sorrow, every moment of connection, and every instance of misunderstanding. Their love stripped of illusion and idealization to show the real foundation of affection and respect and shared dreams that had motivated Elena's desperate bargain and sustained Marcus through months of grief. In this space beyond time and physical limitation, they experienced together the night of their first meeting when Elena's steady hands had guided new life into existence, while Marcus watched in wonder, their courtship unfolding again through shared memory, that showed how each conversation had deepened their understanding of souls that complemented rather than completed each other, their bonding ceremony under the blood moon revealed as the beginning, rather than the culmination of connection that grew stronger through daily choice, rather than magical compulsion. The moment stretched to contain their entire relationship while lasting only heartbeats in external time, perfect intimacy that transcended both vampire nature and human mortality, to touch something universal about the capacity of consciousness to recognize and value other consciousness, love revealed as choice rather than fate, gift rather than possession, strength rather than weakness when properly understood and freely given. In this moment of absolute connection, Marcus spoke the words that would break their bond with voice that carried 3 centuries of accumulated wisdom and love, deeper than anything he had experienced before meeting Elena. Syllables that resonated through multiple dimensions as they reshaped the fundamental forces that had kept her soul anchored to existence through his immortal essence. "I release you, Elena Draven," he said, through voice that made the hospital room's transformed walls ring like struck bells, while reality began reasserting its normal geometry around them. "I release us, both from bonds that were meant to preserve love, but that became chains that prevented its natural expression. May our connection find peace beyond the veil where no magic can corrupt what we freely chose to share." The ceremonial bonding blade dissolved into light that spread through both their forms like liquid starlight, its symbolic function fulfilled through destruction that created rather than merely destroyed, silver radiance that carried the essence of their connection, purified through willing sacrifice and transformed into something that could exist independently of the physical realm's limitations. Elena's soul blazed with reflected light, as the anchor that had trapped her between life and death finally released its hold, her essence becoming visible to Marcus's enhanced senses as something beautiful beyond description. Love given form and consciousness that transcended the boundaries between mortal and immortal existence. Umbra screamed as its anchor to reality began unraveling, the entity's carefully maintained humanoid form flickering between Elena's borrowed beauty and the cosmic horror of its true nature. Tentacles of living shadow and starfire writhing desperately as it felt the connection that had sustained its presence in their dimension, dissolving faster than it could establish new anchors among the city's possessed inhabitants. The reversal energy that Elena had described began manifesting as visible distortions in the space around the entity, reality bending inward, like water circling a drain, while Umbra found itself caught between dimensions. Its consciousness stretched across multiple realms as the magical backlash pulled it inexorably back toward the void between stars, where it had waited for millennia. The entity made one last desperate attempt to maintain its hold on physical reality, reaching tendrils of shadow and starfire toward the city's inhabitants, while opening rifts that showed glimpses of its siblings pressing against dimensional barriers with renewed urgency. But the forces unleashed by the bond's willing dissolution proved too powerful for even its cosmic nature to resist. Elena's soul, now free but still present through love that transcended magical compulsion, channeled the reversal energy through her remaining connection to Umbra with precision that spoke of understanding gained through months of existing within the binding ritual's mechanisms. Her consciousness serving as a conduit for forces that the entity could not deflect or absorb because they originated from willing sacrifice rather than magical coercion. The hospital room snapped back to normal dimensions, with the sound of reality reasserting its proper geometry, walls resuming their mundane function of containing space, while windows once again showed ordinary city streets where emergency vehicles gathered to investigate reports of unexplained phenomena. The building's scars from otherworldly contact remaining as burn patterns and stress fractures that would puzzle investigators for years without providing satisfactory explanations. Umbra's final scream cut across dimensions as the entity found itself pulled back beyond the veil in a cascade of imploding shadows and starfire, its form collapsing into itself like a star dying in reverse, while the rifts it had opened sealed themselves with finality that suggested the barriers between realms had been strengthened rather than weakened by the entity's failed invasion. The possessed humans in the city below collapsed as Umbra's influence withdrew, their consciousness returning to normal function with no memory of the hours spent serving as extensions of alien will, while supernatural beings throughout the metropolitan area felt the oppressive weight of otherworldly presence lifting like storm clouds clearing to reveal clean sky. Elena's form became solid one final time as the reversal energy completed its work, her soul granted temporary physical manifestation through the same forces that were banishing Umbra back to the spaces between stars, allowing her to approach Marcus with steps that made no sound on the hospital room's scarred floor, her face radiant with peace that had been absent during her months of torment between life and death. Their final kiss was gentle and warm, and achingly real. Elena's lips soft against his, while her hands framed his face with touches that carried all the love and forgiveness and gratitude that words could never adequately express. The connection between them purified by sacrifice into something that could exist beyond the boundaries of single-realm existence. "Thank you for loving me enough to let me go," Elena whispered against his mouth, while her form began to fade around the edges like morning mist touched by sunlight. "And thank you for being strong enough to save everyone. When I was too selfish and afraid to make the right choice, our love was real, despite the magic that tried to corrupt it. And now it can be what it was always meant to be, gift freely given rather than chain forged from desperate fear." Her form dissolved into thousands of points of light that spiraled upward like ascending stars, each mote carrying a fragment of shared memory that would remain with Marcus forever, while her essence moved on to whatever realm awaited souls who had learned to love without possession, the hospital room filling with the faint scent of jasmine that would linger just long enough for him to breathe deeply and remember Elena's smile as she faded into light that promised reunion beyond the veil when his own time came to choose between clinging to existence and embracing whatever lay beyond the boundaries of immortal life. Marcus collapsed as the bonding severance tore through his immortal essence like a silver blade carving channels through ancient stone, the fundamental connections that had defined his existence for centuries dissolving with each pulse of reversal energy that Elena's willing sacrifice had unleashed, leaving him fundamentally transformed rather than merely wounded, still vampire in nature, but with supernatural senses muted to whispers of their former intensity, and his connection to the vampire hierarchy weakened until the weight of command that had once felt natural now seemed like borrowed authority from a life he could barely remember living. Serafina and Victor reached him as his legs gave way, their enhanced strength supporting his suddenly fragile form, while emergency lighting flickered back to normal function around them. The hospital room's scarred walls bearing witness to otherworldly contact that would puzzle investigators for decades without providing satisfactory explanations for burn patterns that seemed to have been created by forces that existed beyond conventional understanding of physics and chemistry. Through windows that now showed ordinary city streets rather than glimpses into nightmare dimensions, Marcus watched emergency crews arriving to investigate reports of unexplained structural damage, their mundane concerns about building safety and insurance liability seeming almost surreal after witnessing cosmic horror that had threatened to consume reality itself, while his enhanced hearing struggled to process conversations that his vampire senses should have detected from miles away, but that now reached him as distant murmurs barely distinguishable from the wind. The shadow infection that had spread across the city dissipated like smoke in sunlight as Umbra's influence withdrew completely, possessed humans collapsing on sidewalks before waking with confusion and vague memories of nightmares that their minds would gradually dismiss as stress-induced hallucinations, while supernatural beings throughout the metropolitan area slowly recovered their drained essences. Vampires and witches and shapeshifters emerging from hiding places where they had sought refuge from energies that had corrupted their very nature during the entity's brief but devastating presence in their reality. Serafina's voice carried gentle concern as she helped Marcus stand, her ancient knowledge recognizing symptoms of bonding severance that she had only read about in texts that dealt with theoretical magical catastrophes, her witch-vampire hybrid nature allowing her to sense the fundamental changes that the reversal energy had wrought in his immortal essence. Transformations that went far deeper than simple magical exhaustion and approached the kind of existential alteration that usually accompanied death and resurrection rather than survival. Victor maintained professional composure, despite obvious worry for his commander, the military strategist's tactical mind already calculating the implications of Marcus's weakened condition for vampire hierarchy and territorial security, his scarred features showing the kind of controlled concern that came from witnessing too many battles where victory carried costs that made defeat seem merciful by comparison. Word of Marcus's sacrifice spread through supernatural channels faster than official investigators could document the hospital's damage, reaching the Shadowmere clan before Damien could fully recover from his encounter with the Vampire King in the building's abandoned corridors. The rival faction's leadership forced to acknowledge that Marcus's willingness to destroy his own bond rather than allow cosmic horror to consume reality represented protection of the natural order that transcended political rivalry and territorial ambition. The grudging acknowledgement came through formal channels that vampire diplomacy required, ancient protocols that allowed enemies to recognize heroism without admitting weakness or changing fundamental power structures that had maintained supernatural society's stability for centuries. But Marcus felt hollow rather than vindicated by their respect, incomplete in ways that grief alone couldn't explain. The literal severing of bonds that had connected him to Elena, and through her to forces beyond mortal understanding, leaving gaps in his consciousness that felt like missing organs or amputated limbs. Investigation into Morgana Blackthorn's activities revealed a pattern of exploitation that stretched back decades. The rogue witch's underground lair beneath the city containing evidence of systematic manipulation of desperate supernatural beings who had sought her services during their darkest moments. Dozens of binding circles carved into stone floors with precision that spoke of vast experience in summoning entities from realms that most practitioners avoided for excellent reasons related to survival and sanity. Her sanctum existed in converted subway tunnels that the city had abandoned during construction projects from the previous century. Spaces that official records claimed had been sealed, but that Morgana had transformed into a workshop where otherworldly physics could be studied and exploited without interference from authorities who lacked the knowledge necessary to recognize the true scope of her research into forbidden magical principles. The preserved remains of failed experiments filled glass containers that lined the walls like a museum of cosmic horror, fragments of beings who had volunteered for binding rituals that promised reunion with lost loved ones or power beyond mortal limitations, but that delivered only transformation into components for summoning circles that opened doorways between dimensions, their essence harvested to fuel workings that brought entities like Umbra through barriers that should have remained intact for the safety of all reality. Marcus led the Council strike team through passages that reeked of otherworldly presence, his diminished supernatural senses still detecting traces of alien energy that made his vampire instincts recoil despite their muted intensity, while Seraphina's witch knowledge guided them past protective wards that would have incinerated unauthorized intruders who lacked her understanding of the theoretical frameworks that governed Morgana's experimental magic. Victor's tactical expertise proved invaluable in navigating defenses that combined conventional security measures with supernatural barriers designed to confuse and disorient attackers, his military experience allowing him to recognize patterns in the lair's layout that suggested strategic thinking rather than mere paranoid isolation. They found Morgana in her primary ritual chamber, the witch surrounded by summoning circles that pulsed with energy drawn from dimensions where Umbra's siblings pressed against weakened barriers with increasing desperation. Her efforts to avenge the entity's banishment, requiring magical resources that she was harvesting from bound spirits whose anguished voices created harmonics that made the underground space ring like a bell cast from suffering and regret. The rogue witch had aged beyond her apparent years during the months since Elena's death. Her beauty corrupted by contact with forces that viewed mortal existence as raw material rather than consciousness deserving of respect. Her eyes holding depths that reflected glimpses of realms where time flowed backward and distance could be measured in emotional rather than physical units. Her laugh carried notes of genuine amusement when she recognized Marcus among the strike team, the sound echoing through chambers carved from stone that had never seen sunlight while summoning circles blazed with increasing intensity around her feet, the magical energies she was channeling growing stronger as her ritual approached completion, despite the obvious futility of resistance against forces that included vampire royalty and ancient witch knowledge working in coordination. "You think breaking one bond saves anything?" Morgana taunted while continuing her summoning, despite the weapons trained on her position. "There are always desperate hearts willing to make impossible bargains, always lovers who refuse to accept that death means separation, always parents who would trade their souls for one more moment with children whose loss makes existence meaningless. Your sacrifice only delays what my research has proven inevitable." The ensuing battle destroyed her sanctum in explosions of otherworldly energy that collapsed tunnels and shattered binding circles with violence, that released dozens of trapped spirits into whatever peace awaited consciousness beyond the veil, their liberation creating chain reactions that destabilized the magical framework Morgana had spent decades constructing around her experimental study of interdimensional physics and entity summoning. Seraphina's witch magic proved crucial in redirecting the explosive forces away from the city above, while Victor's tactical coordination ensured that the strike team could maintain offensive pressure despite environmental hazards that included gravity fluctuations and temporal distortions that made conventional military doctrine useless for anything beyond basic survival. The final trap that claimed Morgana came from her own hubris, the witch's desperate attempt to complete her summoning despite obvious defeat, leading her to step into one of her own binding circles where ancient symbols blazed to life with energy that recognized her as a valid sacrifice for the entities she had been trying to call forth. Her consciousness bound to the circle's eternal function, while her body remained trapped in stone that would preserve her awareness, but prevent any movement or communication for however long the magical construct could maintain its integrity. Marcus watched Morgana's fate with satisfaction that carried no joy, understanding that justice for Elena's manipulation and the countless other victims, whose remains filled the underground laboratory, offered closure for crimes committed but could not restore what had been lost or undo the fundamental changes that bonding severance had wrought in his immortal nature, leaving him altered in ways that would require years of adjustment and acceptance, rather than simple healing that time and vampire physiology could provide through conventional recovery. 3 months after Elena's final farewell and Umbra's banishment, Marcus had formally stepped down from his position as Vampire King, transferring leadership to a council of elders whose combined wisdom and experience could guide their people through whatever challenges awaited supernatural society in the aftermath of cosmic horror that had nearly consumed reality itself. His diminished connection to vampire hierarchy making command authority feel like borrowed power rather than natural extension of his immortal essence. The transition had proceeded smoothly despite concerns about power vacuums and territorial challenges, Marcus's sacrifice earning respect from factions that had previously viewed his rule with suspicion or outright hostility, while his continued presence as elder advisor provided continuity that helped maintain stability during leadership changes that could have destabilized supernatural society if mishandled by less experienced politicians. Elena's physical grave remained, as Marcus had created it months before learning of her soul's survival, a simple monument in the private cemetery where vampire royalty traditionally found rest, though he knew now that her essence had moved beyond any realm where stone markers held meaning or significance beyond their value as symbols for those left behind to process grief and loss. The act of laying jasmine flowers on turned earth provided peace that surprised him with its simplicity, the familiar scent carrying memories of love that had transcended magical corruption and found purification through willing sacrifice rather than desperate clinging to connections that should have been allowed their natural endings. Serafina approached through cemetery paths lined with monuments to immortal lives that had finally found their conclusions, her ancient features showing the kind of gentle concern that came from understanding grief through personal experience rather than academic study, her witch-vampire hybrid nature, allowing her to sense the unique situation that bonding severance had created in Marcus's transformed consciousness. The severed bonding had left him with psychic sensitivity to otherworldly threats that remained functional despite his generally diminished supernatural abilities, Serafina explained while they stood together beside Elena's grave, making him valuable as an early warning system for future supernatural incursions that might threaten the delicate balance between dimensions that Umbra's banishment had somehow strengthened rather than weakened. The sensitivity manifested as persistent awareness of spaces between realms where entities like Umbra waited for opportunities to cross over, a cosmic early warning system that operated through mechanisms that Serafina's ancient knowledge could describe but not fully explain, consciousness attuned to interdimensional activity in ways that might prove crucial for detecting threats before they could establish anchor points in physical reality. It wasn't the immortal love that Marcus had shared with Elena, Serafina acknowledged with the wisdom that came from witnessing countless supernatural relationships across centuries of existence, but it represented purpose born from their sacrifice, meaning extracted from loss, through transformation that honored what they had shared while accepting the reality that some connections were meant to serve larger purposes than personal happiness or romantic fulfillment alone could provide. 6 months after Elena's final passing beyond the veil, Marcus encountered Dr. Sarah Chen during a routine consultation with the Supernatural Community's Medical Advisory Board. The human medium's presence unexpected in chambers where vampire royalty typically conducted business with practitioners who understood otherworldly physiology through direct experience rather than academic study. Her professional demeanor and fearless engagement with supernatural mysteries, marking her as someone who worked with the community rather than merely studying it from safe distance. Sarah approached him not as a supplicant seeking vampire protection or favor, but as a colleague concerned about anomalous readings her psychic equipment had detected in locations where Marcus had been present, residual energies that defied conventional classification and suggested ongoing supernatural activity despite the apparent resolution of the cosmic horror that had threatened reality 6 months earlier. Her equipment registered psychic echoes that formed protective patterns around Marcus's presence. Sarah explained with the precise language of someone accustomed to translating supernatural phenomena into terms that bureaucratic oversight could understand and approve, energy signatures that created barriers against otherworldly attention rather than attracting it, as if something was actively shielding him from the kind of interdimensional scrutiny that typically focused on beings who had survived contact with entities from realms beyond mortal understanding. Through conversations that began as professional consultations but gradually developed into something approaching friendship, Sarah revealed her analysis of the unique phenomenon that Elena's willing sacrifice had created. Her love transformed through the bonding's reversal into a protective ward that operated according to principles that combined quantum physics with metaphysical theory in ways that made conventional scientific understanding seem inadequate for describing the reality of consciousness, transcending physical death through emotional connection that had been purified rather than corrupted by magical interference. Elena's essence hadn't simply moved on to whatever realm awaited souls who had learned to love without possession, Sarah explained while reviewing psychic recordings that showed energy patterns resembling floral arrangements in their complexity and beauty, but had somehow left behind a protective residue that functioned as a ward against otherworldly entities that might attempt to exploit Marcus's grief or his newly developed sensitivity to interdimensional activity, her final act of love becoming a shield that operated independently of his conscious awareness or control. The phenomenon defied easy classification according to established magical theory, Sarah admitted, while comparing her readings to case studies from previous supernatural incidents, suggesting that Elena's willing sacrifice had created something unprecedented in recorded history of bonding reversals. Love purified through acceptance of loss, becoming a force that could transcend the boundaries between life and death, without creating the kind of dangerous attachments that entities like Umbra typically exploited for their own purposes. Marcus found himself drawn to Sarah's compassionate pragmatism and her professional approach to supernatural mysteries that treated otherworldly phenomena as puzzles to be understood rather than threats to be feared or powers to be exploited, her humanity providing perspective that centuries of immortal existence couldn't match, while her medium abilities allowed her to perceive aspects of reality that even enhanced vampire senses struggled to detect in their diminished state. Their partnership began when Sarah proposed collaboration on cases involving supernatural beings who had lost bonded partners. Her experience with facilitating peaceful transitions for restless spirits, complementing Marcus's hard-won understanding of grief and his newfound sensitivity to otherworldly threats that made him uniquely qualified to recognize situations where desperate love might create opportunities for cosmic horror to enter reality through emotional vulnerability that transcended rational thought or magical protection. The work proved both challenging and healing, each case requiring careful navigation of grief that manifested in ways that conventional psychology couldn't address, while supernatural elements added layers of complexity that tested both Sarah's professional skills and Marcus's ability to transform personal experience into guidance that could prevent others from repeating Elena's tragic mistakes. When a young vampire couple approached them with a bonding crisis that bore disturbing similarities to what Marcus and Elena had experienced, the female partner displaying symptoms of metaphysical rejection syndrome, while her mate grew increasingly desperate for solutions that might preserve their connection beyond the limitations of vampire human physiology. Marcus found himself able to guide them toward healthier alternatives that honored their love without requiring sacrifices that could create doorways for otherworldly entities seeking anchor points in physical reality. The consultation revealed patterns that Marcus recognized from his own relationship with Elena. Desperate love that refused to accept natural limitations, creating vulnerability to practitioners like Morgana, who offered salvation at prices that seemed reasonable, only to hearts too frightened to consider the broader implications of magical intervention in matters that might be better resolved through acceptance and transformation rather than preservation and control. Through patient counseling that drew on his experience with bonding reversal and Sarah's expertise in facilitating communication between realms, they helped the couple understand that love's greatest expression sometimes involved letting go rather than holding on, connection that transcended physical form without requiring magical anchors that could be exploited by entities whose understanding of emotion differed fundamentally from mortal concepts of affection and devotion. The resolution came when the dying partner chose to complete her transition naturally, while her vampire mate learned to honor their love through memory and service, rather than desperate attempts to preserve connection beyond the boundaries that separated life from death, their farewell creating the kind of peaceful closure that strengthened rather than weakened the barriers between dimensions while allowing both beings to find meaning in loss, that transformed grief into wisdom rather than weapon for cosmic horror. Marcus realized through witnessing their healing that Elena's final gift hadn't been merely his freedom from Umbra's influence, but wisdom born from their shared mistakes, understanding that love could serve purposes beyond personal happiness, when properly channeled into service, that honored what had been shared, while accepting the reality that some connections were meant to transform, rather than endure, unchanged, through whatever challenges mortality and immortality might present. The work with Sarah became Marcus's primary focus as his role in vampire hierarchy shifted from active leadership to elder advisory position, his diminished supernatural abilities proving less important than his hard-won understanding of how grief could be transformed into strength, and how love could transcend the boundaries between realms without creating vulnerabilities that otherworldly entities might exploit for purposes that had nothing to do with the genuine connections that motivated desperate hearts to make impossible bargains. Sarah's human perspective provided balance to Marcus's immortal experience, her mortality lending urgency to their work, while her medium abilities allowed her to perceive aspects of supernatural relationships that even centuries of vampire existence couldn't fully illuminate, their collaboration becoming a model for cooperation between human and supernatural communities that honored the unique strengths each brought to challenges that required both practical wisdom and otherworldly understanding. 1 year after Elena's final departure, Marcus sensed her presence during a dream that felt more real than waking consciousness, her form appearing not through magical compulsion or desperate summoning, but as pure love transcending the boundaries that typically separated living beings from those who had moved beyond physical existence, her essence radiant with peace that spoke of healing and growth that could occur only in realms where time and space operated according to different principles than those governing mortal reality. Elena's appearance carried no urgency or need, no requests for connection or communication beyond the simple joy of seeing that Marcus had found purpose in loss and meaning in transformation. Her love manifested as blessing rather than burden, strength rather than weakness, wisdom gained through experience that honored what they had shared, while accepting the reality that growth sometimes required separation, rather than preservation of connection, in forms that might prevent the evolution that made love meaningful rather than merely comforting. "You're healing," Elena told him through words that came from everywhere and nowhere, carrying the warmth of jasmine-scented memory wrapped around truth that transcended the limitations of language to communicate directly with consciousness, that recognized love in all its forms. "You're helping others heal, and this is what our love was always meant to become, not possession or desperate clinging to what cannot be preserved unchanged, but the strength to let go. When letting go is the deepest expression of caring, wisdom that transforms loss into service, and endings into new beginnings that honor what came before while embracing whatever possibilities await discovery." The dream faded with Elena's form dissolving into the jasmine light that had marked her final departure months earlier. But when Marcus woke in his chambers overlooking the city he had once ruled as vampire king, he found a single jasmine flower on his windowsill. Despite the winter cold and the impossibility of such blooms existing for miles around his residence, the delicate petals perfect in their simplicity and fragrant with memories that carried no pain, only gratitude for love that had learned to express itself through transformation rather than preservation. Marcus placed the flower in a simple vase beside his window where morning light would touch it throughout the day, understanding that Elena's gift was not the flower itself, but the reminder that love's greatest power lay not in holding on to what had been, but in having the courage to transform loss into service, grief into wisdom, and endings into new beginnings that honored the past while embracing whatever future awaited those brave enough to let healing happen in its own time and its own way. The final image that would remain with Marcus as he continued his work with Sarah and the supernatural community showed him walking through city streets at dusk, his enhanced but muted senses detecting the subtle currents of otherworldly energy that flowed through everyday life like underground rivers, carrying power that most mortals never suspected. His presence serving as early warning system for threats that could emerge from spaces between dimensions, while his experience with love and loss provided guidance for others facing similar challenges, carrying Elena's love not as burden that weighed him down with responsibility and regret, but as blessing that made him stronger and wiser and more deeply connected to the fragile beauty of existence itself. Protecting a world that would never know how close it had come to unraveling, walking forward into whatever darkness or light awaited with confidence born from understanding that some bonds transcended death, not through desperate magic or cosmic horror, but through the simple recognition that love transformed through willing sacrifice became something larger and more beautiful than anything that could be contained within the boundaries of single lifetimes or individual hearts. His footsteps echoing through streets where humans and supernatural beings shared space without understanding the delicate balance that kept reality stable, while overhead stars shone with light that had traveled impossible distances to reach eyes capable of appreciating beauty that existed independent of possession or permanence. Love, learning to express itself through service that honored memory while embracing whatever possibilities the future might hold for consciousness. Brave enough to let transformation happen according to its own wisdom, rather than trying to force connection to conform to fears that masqueraded as devotion, but that ultimately served only to limit the very love they claimed to protect.